welcome to the deep dive. You know, when we talk about military leadership, there's a paradox right at the very heart of it. It's maybe the most difficult challenge any organization can face.
It really is.
How do you build a fighting force to be ruthless, to be incredibly effective in their mission, but at the same time, ensure that force stays absolutely, unflinchingly ethical?
That is the ultimate knife edge. Because for any unit to succeed, especially under fire, you have to have deep, deep trust. You need that ironclad cohesion, a loyalty that's almost like a family bond.
Right.
But, and this is the core of what we're looking at today, that exact same loyalty, that fierce protective bond, can sometimes turn inward.
It creates a blind spot.
A huge blind spot. It can open up this ethical void where the group starts to make its own rules and really shields itself from any kind of external accountability.
Exactly. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to explore that critical tension. First, we're going to lay out the institutional blueprint. We'll look at what the system, and specifically the Army, demands from its leaders in terms of character and ethics.
And then we're going to contrast that with these incredibly powerful, almost inescapable psychological and social forces that can push good people, highly trained people, to make just catastrophic moral errors.
And these aren't just abstract ideas. We've got a fantastic set of sources to guide us. We're going to be leaning heavily on the institutional foundation, which is Army Doctrine Publication 622.
Right. That's the one that lays out the Army Leadership Requirements Model. It really tells us what the ideal state is supposed to look like.
Then to really understand how things can go wrong, how that ethical decay happens, we're digging into some critical psychological and sociological work. We'll be looking at Melissa Dittman's reporting in What Makes Good People Do Bad Things,
which is fascinating because it focuses so much on situational psychology and specifically the work of Philip Zimbardo.
Absolutely. And we'll also be scrutinizing those social pressures inside small units through a really foundational piece by Robert Riley, The Darker Side of the Force, the Negative Influence of Cohesion.
And to tie it all together, we'll look at a contemporary case study of leadership failure from Dexter Filkins's incredible reporting, The Fall of the Warrior King. It shows how all these forces play out in the real world in the complexities of a counterinsurgency.
And when we talk about the stakes here, you have to understand this is not just some academic exercise.
Not at all.
Army Doctrine Publication 622 is crystal clear on this.
Yeah.
It says moral failure fundamentally compromises the Army profession's bond of trust. And that trust is twofold.
That's right. It's the internal faith, between commanders and their soldiers, but it's also the external faith with the American people.
And if that bond breaks, the entire legitimacy of the force is put in jeopardy. So that's our baseline. That's the standard we have to keep coming back to.
So let's start with that bedrock, the institutional standard. What exactly is the Army ethic, and how does the doctrine even define the profession itself?
Well, the Army defines its profession as a trusted vocation. And I think that word vocation is important. It's a calling.
It implies more than just a job.
Much more. It's a calling for both the uniformed soldiers and the Department of the Army civilians. And their collective expertise is all about the ethical design, generation, and application of land power. All of it, of course, serving under civilian authority and defending the Constitution.
And the thing that holds all that together is the Army ethic. It's not just a list of thou shalt nots.
No, it's described as the set of enduring moral principles, values, beliefs, and laws that guide the entire profession. It's the thing that creates and sustains that culture of trust we were just talking about.
And that culture of trust it's essential for every soldier on every mission. In every aspect of their life, really. Think of trust as the foundation of the entire structure. The doctrine points to 5 characteristics that reinforce this trust. There's trust itself, which is first on the list.
And then honorable service, military expertise, stewardship.
Right, which is about responsibly managing resources. And finally, esprit de corps, that collective winning spirit.
It's so interesting how trust moves from being this, abstract moral idea to a very real operational requirement.
Mm-hmm.
The doctrine says the Army's relationship with the American people requires the Army to serve ethically, sure, but also effectively and efficiently.
Yes, that's a crucial link. The ethical demand is directly tied to competency. You can't separate them.
And internally, that trust is. It's like the lubricant for the entire machine.
That's a great way to put it. It's the shared confidence up and down the chain of command that everyone is competent, they're reliable, and they are all committed to the exact same moral framework.
So when a commander trusts their subordinates' judgment,
They can delegate authority, they can empower them. That's the heart of mission command, right? It cuts down on micromanagement, it saves resources, and it dramatically speeds up the tempo of operations.
And the flip side is true, too. If that trust breaks down, the friction just increases exponentially.
Oh, absolutely. You get centralized control, you get second guessing, and you lose all that initiative at the tactical edge where it matters most.
Which is why this idea of honorable service, performing your duty by making ethical decisions, is just non-negotiable.
It is. The doctrine is really unambiguous here. It says American values affect every single aspect of how U.S. forces fight and win wars.
So if the ethic is the framework for the institution, then the individual leader has to possess character.
Right. And the doctrine defines character as an individual's true nature, guided by their conscience. It's who you are when nobody's watching.
And becoming a leader of character, it's described as this intensely personal journey. Education, counseling, mentoring, all that can help. It can refine the outward signs.
But the text makes a really profound point here. It says that modifying your deeply held values is the only way to fundamentally change your character.
That requires some serious introspection.
It requires deep introspection and real commitment. It's not a checklist you can just work your way through.
And for a military leader, the most visible, the most critical attribute of that character has to be integrity.
Doing what is right, legally and morally, without fail. It means a leader's decisions and their actions have to be consistent with the Army ethic. Always. The second a leader fails to show good character, they lose the ability to inspire anyone.
And this focus on character really comes into sharp focus when the doctrine talks about personal courage. We throw that term around a lot, but the doctrine breaks it down so well.
It does. It explains that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about having the ability to put that fear aside and do what you know is necessary or right. And it shows up in two very different ways.
The first one is the one I think most people imagine when they hear the word: physical courage.
Right. Overcoming the fear of bodily harm. It's an absolute necessity for accomplishing the mission in a combat zone. And the doctrine uses a powerful historical example for this, Colonel Robert B. Nett.
So Nett, who was a lieutenant at the time in the Philippines during World War II, is leading an assault against these heavily entrenched Japanese positions.
And this is brutal, close quarters fighting. He gets wounded. Seriously wounded.
Not just once.
3 separate times during this one continuous assault. I mean, most people would have been completely out of the fight.
But he refused to give up command. He just kept pressing the attack, leading his soldiers forward through sheer willpower to make sure they captured this critical strong point.
And it was only after the objective was totally secure that he walked unassisted to the rear to get medical attention. That relentless determination, enduring wound after wound to get the mission done, that's the very definition of physical courage.
But as essential as physical courage is, the doctrine really seems to suggest that for sustaining an ethical organization over the long haul, the second type, moral courage, is actually the more critical quality.
And often the more dangerous one to possess.
What do you mean?
Well, moral courage is the willingness to stand firm on your values, on your principles, even when you know it's going to cost you something, personally or professionally.
So it's what allows a leader to take full responsibility for a decision, even if it goes wrong.
Exactly, even if it results in failure. It also shows up as candor, being honest with your superiors, giving them your best professional judgment, even if you know it's not what they want to hear.
And again, the doctrine doesn't just talk about this in the abstract. It gives one of the most powerful real-world examples in military history. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, Jr. at the My Lai massacre.
Thompson was a helicopter pilot flying a reconnaissance mission over the area, providing surveillance for the operation on the ground.
And from the air, he sees American troops firing on unarmed Vietnamese civilians. He realizes instantly that an atrocity is happening, a complete violation of everything the Army stands for.
And his response was immediate, and it was incredibly dangerous. He landed his helicopter between the American soldiers and a group of villagers who were trying to escape.
And this next part is just. It's where his moral courage becomes so clear. He ordered his door gunner to aim his weapon at the American soldiers.
With explicit instructions to fire if they kept advancing on the civilians, he put himself and his crew in the line of fire of his own comrades to stop a massive moral failure.
He risked everything. Being called a traitor, his career, being killed by friendly fire, all of it, to uphold the higher moral law.
The Army ethic and the laws of armed conflict, that's what he was defending.
And it wasn't just a physical intervention. His immediate radio reports are what triggered a ceasefire order in the area, which saved countless more lives. He's held up by the Doctrine because his action was the ultimate expression of integrity under the most extreme pressure.
Which is why leaders need more than just good intentions. They need solid ethical reasoning. The Doctrine calls it the capacity to find moral solutions to diverse and complex problems.
Which is pretty much the definition of war. So how are they supposed to do that? The Doctrine lays out 3 different perspectives for reasoning through these problems.
Right, and you can't just rely on one. The first is looking at desirable virtues, courage, justice, loyalty, honesty. Asking yourself, what kind of person should I be in this moment?
Okay, so that's the first one, virtues.
The second perspective is all about agreed-upon values or rules. Things like the Army values, the laws of war, the Constitution. What does the rule book say I have to do or that I must not do?
And the third one looks at the outcome.
The consequences. You have to ask which choice will produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people, or which one will minimize the most harm.
So an ethically sharp leader has to be able to move between all 3 of those.
Fluidly. They have to make sure their actions are virtuous, that they're compliant with the rules, and that they produce the best possible outcome under the circumstances.
Let's try to ground that. Can we think of an example?
Sure. Imagine a commander after a massive attack. Medical resources are incredibly limited. They have enough to either save one of their own seriously wounded soldiers or treat several lightly wounded civilians, but they can't do both.
Okay.
Well, the commander could look at the rules, perspective 2. Doctrine prioritizes mission accomplishment, which might mean getting that soldier back in the fight.
But then you have to look at the consequences, perspective 3.
Exactly. If you ignore the civilians, you could completely break trust with the local population. That could lead to more instability, more attacks, more suffering for everyone in the long run. It could undermine the whole mission.
And then there are the virtues.
The virtues, perspective 1. The virtue of justice demands impartiality. The virtue of compassion. So a truly ethical leader has to integrate all 3, the rules, the outcomes, and the virtues to find the best, or maybe the least bad, solution.
And that leads to a really important, very practical instruction in the Doctrine.
Yes, leaders must never, ever intentionally issue vague or ambiguous orders just to avoid responsibility.
That's a direct prohibition on moral cowardice.
It is, because unclear orders can be twisted or abused by subordinates who are under immense pressure. At the end of the day, the leader has to accept full responsibility for the consequences of their actions and for the actions of the soldiers who carry out their orders. The institutional expectation is crystal clear.
Okay, so we've established this incredibly high, very clear standard that Army Doctrine Publication 622 sets for character. But if the whole institution is geared towards building and upholding this standard, why do we keep seeing these catastrophic moral failures?
And that's the critical question. This is where the psychological analysis really comes into play. It shifts the focus from, the inherent goodness or badness of the individual to the overwhelming power of the situation itself.
And this is the main insight from Melissa Dittman's reporting, which leans so heavily on the work of social psychologists like Philip Zimbardo.
Right. Zimbardo's analysis, which was prompted by the abuses at Abu Ghraib, directly attacks what he calls the bad apple theory.
The bad apple theory is so tempting, isn't it? It's psychologically comforting. It lets us say, oh, the problem was just a few bad individuals.
It protects our self-image. It lets us think, I could never be a bad apple.
But Zimbardo says that's a dangerous illusion.
A very dangerous illusion. He argues that the line between good and evil is, and this is his word, permeable. Any of us, under the right or maybe the wrong set of situational pressures, can be pushed across it.
That's a really sobering thought.
It is. He argues we all have the capacity for both love and cruelty, and it's the context, the environment, the situation that often pulls that darker side to the surface.
So what you're saying is that things like stress, fear, exhaustion, a lack of clear supervision, those things can actually dominate and override years of ethical training.
In many cases, yes. The pressure of the environment can become a more powerful driver of behavior than a person's individual character.
So how does that happen? How does that transformation take place?
Well, Dittman details this gradual, incremental process that Zimbardo calls the seduction into evil. It's a process first really shown by Stanley Milgram's classic obedience research, And the key is that it's not one big jump across a moral line.
It's a series of small
A
steps.
series of small, almost unnoticeable steps. It starts by providing an ideology to justify the actions.
An ideology, so a way to reframe what you're doing.
Precisely. It's crucial for what psychologists call moral disengagement. In a combat zone, this could mean relabeling the enemy, or even the civilian population. An act that would normally be called cruelty gets semantically reframed as necessary interrogation or force protection.
And once you have that ideology, that justification,
It paves the way for the second and most dangerous step. You make people take a small first step toward a harmful act. This is what Milgram showed so clearly. You don't start by ordering the most extreme act. You start with something minor.
and then you gradually increase it.
You gradually increase the severity. It's the normalization of deviance. Once you've crossed that line once, even in a small way, the next step becomes psychologically much, much easier.
That first small act is like a psychological foot in the door.
That's a perfect way to put it. You've compromised your values, maybe just a little, but you set a new behavioral pattern. And if you don't object to that small act, you become complicit. And the pressure to be consistent with your past actions, even if they were wrong, is immense.
And the system itself can actually make this decay easier.
Oh, absolutely. Zimbardo pointed out that authority structures often provide people with vague and ever-changing rules, and critically, they make it very difficult to exit the situation. Once you've made those small compromises, the social and institutional pressure to just keep going, to comply, to stay quiet, it makes dissent incredibly hard.
And this brings us to two of the most powerful psychological tools in conflict, which link directly back to what we saw at My Lai and Abu Ghraib: dehumanization and anonymity.
Dehumanization is achieved through labeling. Dittman brings up a 1975 study by Albert Bandura that showed the simple power of words. Students in the study who overheard their peers being labeled as animals were way more likely to give them higher levels of electrical shock in an experiment later.
Just a word, just changing the label.
Just changing the label. When you strip the victim of their humanity, when you refer to them by a derogatory name, all the innate ethical barriers that stop us from hurting other people, they start to collapse.
So the soldier isn't hurting a human being anymore. They're hurting a concept, an insurgent, an animal, the other.
And the psychological burden is just lifted. And that collapse is made even worse by anonymity.
When you wear a uniform, a hood, a mask.
Social responsibility plummets. When no one can identify you as an individual, accountability seems to disappear. Zimbardo stresses that when everyone in a group is masked, it creates fear in the targets, sure, but more importantly, it allows the individual to lose their humanity and act more destructively.
And there's some powerful anthropological evidence for this, too.
There is. John Watson, a Harvard anthropologist, studied 23 different cultures back in 1974. He was looking for a link between warriors who changed their appearance using war paint or masks and how they treated their victims.
And what did he find?
He found that 80% of the warriors who changed their appearance were far more destructive. They were more likely to kill, torture, or mutilate their victims compared to those who didn't change their appearance.
So the combination of dehumanizing labels and the anonymity of the environment creates this perfect storm for ethical failure.
It does, and it can happen regardless of an individual's core character. The conclusion from this is just so powerful. You don't necessarily need a pre-existing motive to do evil. You just need a situation that systematically makes it easier to cross that permeable moral line. And these situational forces, they get amplified immensely by the power of the small unit. Which brings us right to the dual nature of group cohesion.
We've said it's essential. Army Doctrine Publication 622 defines esprit de corps as the Army's winning spirit, that collective ethos of trust and teamwork that lets organizations get through incredible adversity.
And Robert Riley, in his analysis, he confirms this basic sociological truth of combat. Soldiers fight, first and foremost, for the other people in their small unit.
They fear losing the respect of their peers.
More than they fear death itself. They're more afraid of being seen as a coward by the 3 or 4 people they live with and fight with than they are of an enemy bullet. That small group is their primary source of security and purpose.
But that intense loyalty is exactly where the danger comes in.
It is. Riley calls this danger negative cohesion. This is what happens when that tightly bonded unit starts to develop its own norms for behavior that actively conflict with the values of the larger organization, with the Army ethic.
And that's the absolute crux of the moral dilemma in combat. The group norms. The way a unit does its business, how it treats prisoners, how it deals with civilians, Those are powerful cultural forces.
And in a crisis, in a high-stress situation, a soldier will almost always choose loyalty to their close friends over their obligation to the institutional army ethic or some far-off headquarters.
And these norms don't have to be, overtly criminal to be damaging.
No, not at all. They can be very subtle deviations. Riley points to examples from Vietnam, where some highly cohesive units developed norms that prize personal survival above aggressive mission accomplishment.
So in that kind of environment, the unit might subtly discourage someone from being too aggressive on patrol.
Right. They might start to see a hero who takes risks as someone who's actually endangering the rest of the group. And so the unspoken rule becomes apathy, or just avoiding contact if you can.
They'll follow the letter of the law, but not the spirit.
Exactly. They go on patrol, they file the reports, but they don't follow the commander's intent. The unit's own self-preservation becomes the real moral norm, even if it undermines the entire mission.
The My Lai massacre is just the most extreme, tragic example of this negative cohesion. Rayleigh looked at Charlie Company, and the shocking thing is it wasn't a unit full of deviants.
No, outwardly it was a normal unit. It was highly cohesive. It was known as the best company in the battalion. They'd been training together for 9 months.
And yet, that same cohesion allowed the unit to slide into its own unique moral universe. There's a quote from a soldier who was assigned to Charlie Company, and he said of them,
What they thought was right, and what they thought was wrong. The definitions for things were turned around. Courage was seen as stupidity. Cowardice was cunning and wariness.
that is the perfect definition of negative cohesion.
It is. The unit's own values had diverged so completely from the Army ethic that they created this internal moral code where cruelty and brutality weren't just acceptable, but were sometimes even seen as heroic acts of retaliation.
In the investigation that followed, the peers' inquiry, it concluded that this was fundamentally a failure of leadership and a failure of sustained ethical training.
And therefore, it could happen again, anywhere. The assumption had been that soldiers just carried their community values with them onto the battlefield, and that those values would just hold up under pressure.
But the inquiry found that ethics and morality training just wasn't done well or often enough. Leaders were focused on the hands-on skills, weapons, tactics.
Leaving this huge ethical void in the soldiers' minds about what was actually expected of them in these morally gray situations.
Riley really stresses the lesson here. Values decay over time.
Especially under the acid test of combat. They are not a one-time inoculation you get in basic training. They have to be constantly regenerated, renewed, and taught with repeated emphasis.
So once a unit does go wrong, how does the system even find out about it? This brings us back to the silence that is enforced by that same group loyalty.
Right. Many atrocities happen not because everyone participates, but because of the unit's unobjecting silence. Riley confirms that soldiers almost never report members of their own unit who commit crimes because the bond of comradeship just wins out.
It's almost impossible to tell tales on men your life depends on.
When that small group is your only source of security in a life-or-death situation, yes, it's incredibly difficult.
So the unit's collective morality becomes a weight, and it's heavier than the individual soldier's personal sense of right and wrong.
It is. For a soldier to do what Hugh Thompson did, to show that kind of moral courage, their personal commitment to the Army ethic has to be so strong that it outweighs the group's powerful norms and that perceived need for security that the group provides.
Which is why leadership has to be the dominant, positive moral force inside that group. It has to be a continuous effort.
Constantly. The leader's job is to make sure that the unit's norms are always aligned with the Army's goals and the Army ethic, and to stop negative cohesion before it ever takes root.
And that discussion of negative cohesion leads us right to the critical role of leadership integrity, especially at the command level. When a small unit goes wrong, it's often a failure of training. But when a commander fails, the whole ethical structure can just collapse.
And Dexter Filkin's reporting on Colonel Nathan Sassaman, The Fall of the Warrior King, gives us this modern, really chilling look at how that decay happens in an operational environment.
By all the normal operational metrics, Sassaman was a star, a top-tier commander. He was nimble, aggressive, highly effective in the Sunni Triangle in Iraq.
He really mastered that complex counterinsurgency mission. He could do the nation building, the outreach by day, and then at night he was leading aggressive raids, hunting insurgents.
The source material paints him as a leader who got results. Insurgent attacks would spike when he was gone and drop the moment he got back. He had immense physical courage and this confidence that made him seem almost invincible.
He was exactly the kind of figure the Doctrine champions for tactical success. But a leader's effectiveness means absolutely nothing if their character fails. And Sassaman's career imploded because of a catastrophic failure of integrity and moral courage.
It shows that tactical excellence and ethical rot can exist in the same person.
They can. The incident itself involved his men throwing 2 Iraqi detainees into the Tigris River. It was a form of non-lethal punishment, but it was clearly abusive and demeaning, and the army had already started a formal investigation.
This is the moment. This is the test of character.
And he failed it completely. Facing the consequences, Sassaman disregarded his moral duty, and he ordered his subordinate, Captain Matthew Cunningham, to cover it up, to lie.
His instruction was so simple and so corrosive. Tell them about everything except the water.
It's a textbook example of moral failure. The doctrine demands leaders show moral courage by taking full responsibility for their decisions, especially when things go wrong. Sassaman did the exact opposite. He chose self-preservation and protecting the unit's reputation over the law and over integrity.
And this kind of behavior from a senior leader is precisely what the doctrine calls counterproductive leadership.
Yes. Army Doctrine Publication 622 defines this as any leader behavior that violates the Army's core competencies or values and that prevents a climate where the mission can be accomplished.
And it's an important distinction. A counterproductive leader isn't just someone who is a hard charger or demanding.
No. They actively leave the organization in a worse state than they found it. They undermine morale, trust, commitment. And ultimately, they undermine readiness, even if they get a few short-term tactical wins.
The Sassaman case really highlights 2 categories of this from the doctrine. The first is corrupt behaviors.
Right. Willfully violating explicit Army standards and regulations, the cover-up, the lying to investigators. That's a conscious choice to ignore the entire legal and ethical framework.
And the second is abusive behaviors.
Cruelty, excessive use of authority, degrading others. Filkin's reporting mentioned that during some house searches, the level of destruction was so unnecessary that the only possible explanation seemed to be, and this is a quote, to humiliate the local population.
And humiliation is an act of power designed to degrade and control. It's the opposite of maintaining trust. It violates the Army value of respect.
And when a commander tolerates that, or even encourages it, it sends a signal to every single subordinate that the Army ethic is optional, that it's secondary to the immediate goal. And that creates a climate that is just ripe for negative cohesion.
The effect of this toxic behavior is systemic. It's like a poison. It erodes well-being, it kills engagement. In the end, it undermines the long-term effectiveness of the unit.
And the doctrine recognizes this. It recognizes that all leaders are susceptible to these behaviors, especially under intense stress or in chaotic conditions.
And that's why the doctrine puts such a high value on constant vigilance and self-regulation. The solution starts with aggressive self-awareness.
Leaders have to be actively seeking out honest feedback. From subordinates, from peers, from their own bosses. They have to have the humility to ask tough questions about their own performance and their own ethical blind spots.
And that reflection has to extend outward to the unit's climate.
The leader has a fundamental duty to continuously assess and maintain an ethical climate. And you do that by watching what your subordinates do and by monitoring all the other little indicators of misconduct.
So it's more than just reading reports.
Much more. It's assessing the organization from the bottom up, using command climate surveys, walking around, actively looking for the subtle signs, like corrosive personalities, a high rate of minor infractions, or instances of abuse of authority that just get ignored.
And the doctrine is unambiguous about this.
Every single member of the Army has to be willing to confront and address counterproductive behaviors. But if the leader, the person whose character is supposed to be the anchor for the entire unit, if they lack the moral courage to stop the rot, then the whole structure fails.
So this deep dive has really mapped out the full landscape of ethical leadership. We've seen that trying to sustain an ethically aligned organization in war is this constant dynamic struggle.
It's a struggle between the institutional moral mandate on one side and these incredibly powerful, corrosive forces you find in the operational environment on the other.
And we identified those erosive forces pretty clearly. Situational pressures that make evil feel incremental.
Anonymity and dehumanization that can unlock violence.
And that negative group cohesion that creates a protective ethical bubble around the small unit.
And the countermeasure to all of it is singular and consistent. Strong ethical leadership. Leaders who continuously model character, demand accountability, and actively monitor the moral health of their unit.
Now we know that in modern operations, Leaders at higher levels have to rely on filtering information and on mission command to manage the overload and stay agile.
Right, they have to delegate complex decisions down to the lowest possible level. And that creates this huge geographical and psychological distance between the senior commander and the soldier on the ground.
And that delegation is essential for speed, but it makes ethical oversight incredibly difficult. The commander is just physically removed from the reality of that moment of contact.
So, if the ultimate solution relies on making sure your subordinates have and use moral courage when you, the commander, are not physically there to enforce the ethic.
Then the critical challenge for every commander right now is this.
Given your reliance on mission command and the necessity of filtering information to maintain your operational tempo, what specific, non-technological feedback loops must you establish now today to accurately measure the ethical climate and the subtle, informal group norms in your lowest echelons, ensuring they possess the resolve and moral courage to uphold the Army ethic when you are miles away? That is the enduring test of ethical leadership in modern war.
A profound challenge that demands immediate action and constant reflection. Thank you for taking this essential deep dive with us today.
Until next time.